Hey, welcome to week 6, everybody. This is Pug, Mr. Crolet's dog, standing in for him today. And he tells us we're working on pseudocidal functions. I love pseudocidal functions, so I'm real excited to help you out here today. So let's take a look at what we're doing. So we're going to write a pseudocidal function, which is just a sine cosine function. If you know a graph or if you're given the amplitude and the period. All right. All right, so the first thing we do is we find A. That's the amplitude. Now, A in this case is going to be 2. Now, both of these graphs have the same amplitude. This is a amplitude that's -2. But amplitude can't be negative, all right? The negative just means it's flipped. So even though this graph is flipped, both have an amplitude of 2. One is just negative, that's all. Of 2. So when we write these equations here, we're going to actually have y equals a +2, and this is a sine graph. And then we're going to have another graph, y equals -2. So there'll be a positive and a negative. All right, now what we have to do is figure out what the frequency is. Okay, the frequency was how many times we see the function between 0 and 2 pi. All right, so if we look at this, we're told that the period is 2 pi. So I'm going to take this formula here. I'm going to take out the word 2 pi and or period and put in 2 pi. And then I'm going to solve this for, this is the Greek letter omega. Last week we used B. I just wanted to show you different letters because I think on Math Excel they use omega, which looks like a W. All right, now what I'm going to do is solve this for omega. Okay, so to do that, I would multiply both sides by omega. And then I get omega sine times 2 pi equals 2 pi. So what times 2 pi is equal to 2 pi? Well, that's got to be 1. And if I went ahead and did the algebra, I would get omega is 1. So that's telling me that the frequency is 1. I see one cycle. When I say frequency, I mean there's one cycle of sine between 0 and 2 pi. That's what frequency stands for. So now when I write out my formula here, all right, omega is equal to 1. And I really don't need that 1. So even though we know it's there, so this would just end up being 2 sine x or -2 sine x. All right, next example. Now, this one it says write the equation of a sine function with an amplitude of 2. All right, so we already know that A could either be 2 or -2. It can be either one of those. Both of them have the same amplitude. So when I write my equation over here, I'll have one equation with a -A, and I'll have one equation with a +A. Both of them have the same amplitude though. All right, now it says the period is 2. Now the reason I picked this one is because it looks real similar to the previous one where it says the period is 2 pi. But this, there's no pi symbol. It's just the number 2. So you can see the graphs don't even look the same. This graph is more stretched out than this graph. So a period of 2, what it did was it took the graph and it squeezed it in towards the y-axis, like pushing a spring in. So this actually has this graph is going to have a higher frequency than this graph. Okay, and you can see that here's one cycle of sine. There's one. And then if I kept going and just highlighted other ones, here's 2 full cycles of sine. And then if I did a third one, here's 3. There's 3 cycles of sine. So our B value is going to be somewhere around that, okay? Or our omega value. Okay, so I take my period, 2, and I substitute it into the word period. So that's going to give me 2 equals 2 pi divided by omega. Okay, now we're going to solve for omega. So omega is equal to pi, which is about 3.14. And that's what we saw here. We saw 3, 1, 2, 3 cycles, and then a little extra part of a cycle. So our B value or our omega value is going to be pi. So this is going to be pi times x, pi times x. And there's your 2 equations. Now we've got cosine functions, and we're told the amplitude is 3. So 3 could be an amplitude, or negative 3 could be. So our equations are going to be a negative 3 cosine omega x and a 3 cosine omega x. Alrighty. Period's 3 pi. So we replace the word period with 3 pi, and then we solve it for that variable omega. And I get omega is, or the frequency is 2/3. So my W or my omega comes out here and I replace it with 2/3. So 2/3 is like 0.666 of a cycle. So we should see that's a little bit more than a half of a cycle. So here's our cosine, and by the time we get to 2, there's our cutoff at 2 pi. So you see we don't see a full cycle of sine or cosine, we only see 6/10 of a cycle between 0 and 2 pi. All right, now here we got a period of 3. Everything else is the same as the previous problem. But now the period, instead of it being 3 pi, the period is the number 3. It's the value 3. Okay? Remember, period being 3 pi, that's like saying around 9. Because 3 times 3.14 is around 9. All right, so this graph has a much longer period than this graph. This graph, you can see, has got a much higher frequency. Okay, so if we looked at this, you can see there's 1 cycle, 2 cycles, and a little bit more than 2 cycles between 0 and 2 pi. All right, so let's see what we get here now. So I take out the word period and I replace it with 3, because that's what I'm told the period is. And now, same arithmetic here. There's just not a pi, that's all. So this is the period, or that's the frequency now. Okay, that's not a period, that's frequency. And that frequency, I'll show you, is around 2. Okay, so if I go 2 times pi divided by 3, that frequency is really close to 2 cycles between 0 and 2 pi, and that's what we saw. Last part is you're given the graph and you got to find the equation. So here are your steps. First of all, you got to identify the function. Is it a sine, a cosine, or is it one of those flipped? So when we look at this first graph, we can see this is going to be a sine function, and I'm going to trace 1 cycle. All right, so 1 cycle of sine looks to be 8 pi. So our period here is 8 pi. And our amplitude is 4. Okay, so I got A is 4. All right, now I don't have to worry about it being -4 because I have the graph, and the graph is not a negative because it's not flipped. Alrighty, now let's take this period here, substitute it into this formula for the word period, and solve it for omega. Divide both sides by omega, or by, I'm sorry, 8 pi. Those cancel, and omega becomes 1/4. So this graph here would be y equals, it's a sine graph, so 4 sine 1/4 x. All right, our next one is also a sine, but now it goes down first, then up, and it looks like it's 1 cycle has a period of 4. Notice there's no pi on this. There's no pi on that number like there was over here. All right, so our amplitude -2, so we know our equation is going to be -2 sine omega times x. So we got to figure out what the frequency omega is. So we take our period 4, put it in for the word period, and now solve this for omega, and omega tells us the frequency, how many cycles we see between 0 and 2 pi. Pi over 2. All right, now pi over 2, okay, if we convert that into a decimal, so I would write this, my omega is pi over 2 and then x. Now pi over 2, I did it over here, that's like 1 point, around like 1.5, 1.6. So between 0 and 2 pi, we should see 1.5 cycles. Okay, now remember, 2 pi, if you wrote it on here, 2 pi would be around 6.28. It would be out here. That's the same as 2 pi. So if we look at the cycles, well, that looks like yeah, that's a sine. So there's one cycle, and if we kept going, we'd have about a half of another. So that's like 1.5 cycles right there to get to 2 pi, which is the frequency. All right, and now the last two. Okay, so now we're dealing with, let's take a look at this. This looks like a cosine function with an amplitude of 3. And this looks like an upside down cosine function, and I'm going to say that looks like -8. Okay, now let's figure out what the period is here, and then we can get the frequency. So 1 cosine looks like it takes to get to pi before we see 1. So the period is pi. So our frequency is going to be 2. Omega is the frequency. So if we were to draw this all the way out to 2 pi, we'd see 2 cycles between 0 and 2 pi. Okay, the next one, we've got an upside down or flip cosine, and there's 1 cycle. So let's see, these are 1, 2, looks like that's 3, 4, 5. So here the period is 3. So 2 pi over omega. And my omega is 2 pi over 3. So I take out the symbol omega and I put in 2 pi over 3 x. And that's how we write equations for sine and cosine. I think it's time for my dinner, so take care. Mr. Krolak will probably be back tomorrow.